The sun dominated the entire sky, bright and unforgiving, stretching across miles of open highway without a single cloud to interrupt it. The asphalt shimmered under the heat, creating waves that blurred the horizon and made the road feel endless. It was the kind of day drivers trusted, the kind of day that felt safe, predictable, almost too perfect for anything to go wrong. Emily Carter drove straight through it, her truck cutting across the highway with steady force, the engine humming in a rhythm she had learned to live with. Years on the road had turned every movement into instinct. Her hands adjusted the wheel without effort, her eyes scanned the mirrors automatically, her body responding before her mind even needed to think. On the outside, everything was control. Everything was routine. But inside, nothing was calm. Her thoughts kept circling the same thing over and over again, like a problem that refused to be solved no matter how far she drove. The mortgage, the house, the deadline that kept getting closer no matter how many miles she put behind her. A notification flashed briefly on her phone, lighting up the dashboard for just a second before fading again, but that was enough. She didn't need to read it. She already knew what it meant. Final warning. Time was gone. That house wasn't just another bill. It was the last thing her parents had left behind, the only place where her past still existed in something real. Every wall, every room, every detail carried memories that couldn't be replaced. Losing it wouldn't just be losing a home, it would be losing everything that still connected her to them. And no matter how hard she worked, it wasn't enough. Every delivery bought her a little time, but never enough to fix the problem. Every mile felt like she was chasing something that kept moving further away. Sleep had turned into short, broken moments, never real rest, never enough to quiet the pressure building inside her chest. Even on a perfect day like this, the kind of day where nothing was supposed to go wrong, she could feel it clearly. She was running out of time. The road stretched ahead, empty and bright, with only a few distant vehicles scattered across the highway. Everything looked normal. Everything felt stable. Until something small changed, something most drivers wouldn't even notice. A car ahead drifted slightly out of its lane. Just enough to be strange, Emily's eyes locked in immediately. Her focus sharpened without hesitation, her instincts taking over before she even questioned it. The car corrected itself, moving back into place as if nothing had happened. But seconds later it drifted again, this time more aggressively, the movement sharper, unstable, wrong. There was no rain, no obstacle, nothing on the road that could explain it. And then everything escalated at once. The car jerked violently, overcorrecting in a way that instantly broke control. The rear tires lost grip against the hot asphalt, and within a fraction of a second, the vehicle spun across the highway under the full brightness of the sun. There was no darkness to hide it, no storm to blur the details. Everything happened in clear, brutal visibility. One spin. Then another. The sound hit next, loud and violent, metal crushing against itself as the car flipped and rolled off the side of the road, landing in a twisted wreck that looked completely out of place under such a perfect sky. Silence followed immediately. Heavy and unnatural. Emily reacted without thinking. Her foot slammed the brake, the truck slowing hard as the weight of it pushed forward before settling. Her heart started racing, not from fear, but from instinct, from recognition, from the understanding that this wasn't something small. This was serious. For a split second, she stayed still, her hands gripping the wheel, her eyes locked on the wreck in the distance as her mind calculated everything at once. Stopping meant losing time. Stopping meant delaying everything she was already struggling to keep together. The house, the debt, the pressure, all of it waiting for her, all of it getting worse with every second she wasn't moving forward. But leaving meant something else. It meant walking away from someone who might not survive. The decision happened before doubt had a chance to exist. She pulled the truck fully to the side of the road, the engine still running, the sunlight still harsh and unchanged, as if nothing had happened at all. She opened the door and stepped out into the heat, immediately feeling the difference, the heavy air, the smell of hot asphalt mixed with something sharper, something wrong. She moved fast, each step closing the distance between her and the wreck, her focus narrowing, everything else disappearing from her mind. The closer she got, the worse it looked. The front of the car was crushed beyond recognition, metal folded into itself, glass scattered across the ground reflecting the sunlight in sharp fragments. And inside, there was a man, unconscious, barely moving. Blood ran down the side of his face, visible in every detail under the bright sky, impossible to ignore, impossible to soften. There was no hiding the reality of it. Emily stopped for less than a second, just long enough to understand exactly how bad it was. Then she moved. Because in that moment, nothing else mattered anymore. Not the debt. Not the house. Not the life waiting to collapse behind her. Only one thing remained clear. If she didn't act now, he wouldn't survive. And without realizing it yet, that single decision was about to change everything. The heat pressed down harder as Emily moved closer to the wreck, the sunlight reflecting off twisted metal and shattered glass in a way that made everything feel sharper, more real, more urgent. There was no chaos from weather, no darkness to hide what had happened, only a clear, unforgiving view of how quickly everything could fall apart. The car was completely destroyed. The front end had collapsed inward, the structure no longer recognizable as something that once moved freely on the road. Smoke rose lightly from the engine, bending in the warm air, while small fragments of debris spread across the asphalt like evidence of how violent the impact had been. Inside, the man remained barely conscious, his body trapped in an unnatural position, his breathing shallow and inconsistent. Every second he stayed there made the situation worse. Emily didn't hesitate. Her movements were fast, precise, driven by instinct more than thought. She reached the side of the vehicle and forced her hands into the broken frame, searching for leverage, ignoring the sharp edges pressing against her skin. The door resisted at first, bent out of shape, stuck in a position it was never meant to hold. She applied more force. The metal shifted slightly. Not enough. Time kept moving. She adjusted her stance, planted her feet harder against the ground, and pulled again, pushing past resistance until something finally gave. The sound of metal bending broke through the silence, harsh and final, creating just enough space to reach inside. The heat trapped within the car hit differently, thicker, harder to breathe through. Her focus narrowed completely. Nothing else existed. She reached in, carefully but quickly, supporting his weight, checking for any sign that moving him would make things worse. His body responded weakly, unstable, but still alive. That was enough. She pulled him free. The effort was heavy, every movement slower than she wanted, but she didn't stop. The weight didn't matter. The difficulty didn't matter. Only distance mattered. Getting him out. Getting him away from the wreck before anything else went wrong. Step by step, she moved back toward the truck. The sun remained unchanged, bright and indifferent, casting light over everything as if this moment meant nothing to the world around it. But for him, it meant everything. By the time she reached the truck, her breathing had intensified, her arms strained from the effort, but she didn't slow down. She lifted him into the passenger seat, adjusting his position quickly, making sure his airway stayed clear, making sure he was stable enough for what came next. Because waiting wasn't an option. Not here. Not now. Emergency services would take time. Too much time. And time was the one thing he didn't have. She moved around the truck, climbed back into the driver's seat, and turned her focus forward again. The engine was still running, vibrating through the frame, ready to move the second she made the decision. She didn't think twice. The truck accelerated back onto the highway, faster than before, cutting through the open road with urgency that broke the calm rhythm of the day. Everything around her blurred slightly as speed increased, the horizon shifting, the distance closing faster than it should. Her eyes moved constantly, checking the road. Checking him, checking everything at once. His condition hadn't improved. If anything, it felt more fragile. His breathing remained uneven, unpredictable, as if it could stop at any moment without warning. That pressure built instantly. Every second became heavier. Every mile became critical. The road ahead stayed clear, open, almost too perfect, and that contrast only made the situation feel more intense. There was no external danger slowing her down, no traffic, no obstacles, nothing to blame if things went wrong. Only time, and the realization that she was racing against it. Her grip on the wheel tightened as the truck pushed forward, the engine responding with steady power, carrying both of them towards something uncertain. She had no guarantee he would make it, no certainty that what she was doing would be enough. But stopping wasn't an option anymore. Not after this. Not after she made the choice to pull him out. Not after she took responsibility for what happened next. The distance to the nearest hospital felt longer than it should have, stretching in a way that made every second feel extended, heavier, more difficult to ignore. The sunlight continued to flood the road, unchanged, almost mocking the urgency of the moment. Everything looked normal, but nothing was. And as the truck pushed forward at full speed, carrying a life that could disappear at any moment, one thought became impossible to ignore. Who was he? Because something about this didn't feel random. Something about him didn't feel ordinary. And deep down, without knowing why, Emily felt like this moment was only the beginning. The hospital doors closed behind her with a dull, controlled sound that felt completely disconnected from everything that had just happened outside. The sunlight, the heat, the chaos of the accident, none of it followed her inside. Here, everything was cold, structured, precise. The man was taken immediately. Doctors moved fast, voices low and urgent, steps calculated, decisions happening in seconds. Equipment surrounded him, machines replacing instinct, training taking over where raw action had ended. Within moments, he disappeared behind restricted doors, leaving Emily standing still for the first time since the accident. And that stillness hit harder than anything else. Because when movement stopped, everything she had been pushing away came back at once. Her body felt heavy, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind exhaustion that ran deeper than physical strain. Her hands still carried the tension from pulling him out of the wreck, her arms sore, her breathing slowly returning to normal. But none of that mattered, because her mind had already shifted, back to the one thing she couldn't escape. Her phone lit up again. The screen reflected against her tired eyes as she stared at it for a moment longer than she should have. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to confirm what she already knew, but avoiding it wouldn't change anything. The message was clear. Final stage. No extensions. No more delays. The mortgage had reached the point where everything became irreversible. The house was no longer at risk. It was already slipping away. A tight pressure formed in her chest, sharper than before, heavier, more difficult to push aside. That place wasn't just another financial responsibility. It was the only thing her parents had left behind, the only piece of her past that still existed in a world that kept moving forward without them. Every memory lived there. Every moment that mattered, and now, all of it was being reduced to numbers she couldn't keep up with. She lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tightening around it as if holding it harder would somehow change what it said. It didn't. Nothing changed. The hallway around her remained quiet, people moving in controlled patterns, focused on their own realities, their own emergencies, their own lives. No one noticed her. No one knew what she was carrying. And that made it heavier. Because everything she was dealing with alone. She sat down without realizing it, the chair cold beneath her, her body finally giving in to the weight she had been holding up for too long. Her eyes stayed forward, unfocused, not really seeing anything in front of her. The numbers kept repeating in her mind. The deadlines. The missed payments. The warnings she had been trying to outrun for months. Every delivery she took, every extra mile she pushed herself to drive, every night she sacrificed sleep, it had all been for one purpose. To save that house. But it wasn't working. No matter how hard she tried, the gap kept growing. And now, there was no more time left to close it. A wave of exhaustion hit her differently this time, not just physical, but emotional, deep, overwhelming. It wasn't just about being tired anymore. It was about reaching a point where effort no longer made a difference, where trying wasn't enough. Her thoughts drifted back to the house without her choosing to think about it. The front door slightly worn from years of use. The quiet inside that still felt familiar. The small details that meant nothing to anyone else, but everything to her. That place had survived time. But it might not survive this. Her chest tightened again, her breathing slowing as she tried to keep control, trying to hold everything together just a little longer. Because once that was gone, there would be nothing left to hold on to. Time passed without her noticing. Minutes stretched, blending together in a way that made everything feel distant. The world around her continued to move, but she remained in the same place, stuck between what had just happened and what was about to happen. And for the first time, thought crossed her mind that she couldn't ignore. What if she couldn't fix this? What if no matter what she did, it was already too late? That possibility settled in slowly, heavier than anything she had felt before. Because deep down, she knew the answer. And as she sat there, in a place where lives were being saved just a few meters away, she realized something that made everything feel even more real. She had just saved someone else's life. But she was about to lose her own. Time moved forward, but not in a way that felt real. Hours passed inside the hospital, measured by shifting light through the windows and the constant, controlled movement of people who never stopped. Emily remained there longer than she had planned, longer than she could afford, but leaving didn't feel possible. Not yet. Because something about what happened on that road hadn't fully settled. And neither had what was happening in her own life. Eventually, the waiting ended. Not with noise. Not with urgency. But with quiet confirmation. The man had survived. Stabilized. Pulled back from the edge in a way that only happens when timing, action, and chance align perfectly. The kind of outcome that doesn't happen often. And somehow, she had been part of it. That should have felt like relief. And for a moment, it did. A brief shift in the weight she had been carrying. A small break in the pressure. But it didn't last. Because the rest of her reality was still there, unchanged, waiting for her the second she stepped away from this place. She stood up slowly, her body still heavy, her thoughts already returning to everything she had tried to ignore. The house, the debt, the final notice that had made everything feel inevitable. Saving him hadn't changed any of that. It hadn't bought her time. It hadn't solved anything. It had only delayed the moment she would have to face it again. She started moving toward the exit, each step pulling her further away from what had just happened, and closer to what she couldn't escape. The bright sunlight outside hit her immediately as the doors opened, the same clear sky still stretching endlessly above, unchanged from the moment the accident happened. The world had moved on. As if nothing had happened at all. But something stopped her before she could take another step forward. A subtle shift. A feeling that she wasn't as disconnected from that moment as she thought. Behind her, things were changing again. Not in the same urgent way as before, but in a way that mattered just as much. Because inside one of those rooms, the man she had pulled from the wreck was no longer just surviving. He was aware. Fully conscious. An awareness changes everything. Not just for the person who wakes up, but for the person who put them in that position. Because memory begins to return. Details start to connect. Moments that were once blurred become clear. And in those moments, people start asking questions. Even without words, understanding forms. Recognition builds. The realization that someone stepped in at the exact moment everything could have ended. And that realization doesn't disappear. It grows. Inside that room, his condition had shifted from survival to awareness, from instinct to thought. His mind was beginning to process what had happened, reconstructing fragments of memory, filling in gaps, searching for the point where everything went wrong, and the moment where it didn't end. And somewhere in that process, one detail stood out. Not the crash, not the impact, but what came after. The presence of someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Someone who chose to stop. Someone who chose to act. Back outside, Emily continued walking, unaware of how much had already changed behind her. Her steps were steady, but her thoughts were heavier than before, pulled back into the reality she couldn't escape. The truck. The road. The next delivery. The next attempt to fix something that felt impossible to fix. Her life was still moving in the same direction. Still under the same pressure. Still heading toward the same outcome. But something had shifted. Not in her world. Not yet. Somewhere else. Because the man she had saved wasn't just recovering. He was paying attention. And what he was starting to understand would not stay inside that hospital room for long. As Emily reached her truck and climbed back inside, the engine starting with a familiar vibration, everything seemed to return to normal on the surface. The road was still there. The sky was still clear. The day was still bright. But beneath that normality, something had already begun. A chain of events she didn't see. A decision she didn't know about. A connection that had just been created between two lives that were never supposed to meet. And as she drove away, returning to the same road that had brought her there, one truth quietly settled into place. That moment wasn't over. It was just beginning. The highway felt the same as always when Emily returned to it. Endless lanes stretching forward. Sunlight reflecting off the asphalt. Distant vehicles moving like nothing important had ever happened just hours before. But she felt different. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But in a way that stayed underneath everything. The kind of shift that doesn't announce itself, but slowly changes how you carry every second that follows. Her hands stayed on the wheel, steady out of habit, but her mind kept drifting back to the hospital, to the moment she left, to the man she pulled out of the wreck, to the fact that he was still alive. That should have been enough to settle her thoughts. But it wasn't, because the pressure waiting for her outside that moment hadn't disappeared. It had simply stayed in place, untouched. The house. The mortgage. The final notice. Every mile she drove brought her closer to a reality she was running out of ways to delay. The numbers didn't change. The deadlines didn't move. Time kept doing what it always did, moving forward without waiting for anyone to catch up. She passed exits she had driven through countless times before, but none of them felt familiar in the same way anymore. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt stable. And somewhere in the back of her mind, something kept repeating. That accident wasn't random. Not fully. There had been no weather, no obstacle, no visible reason for the car to lose control so suddenly under a perfect sky. Just a break in motion. A collapse in control that didn't match the conditions around it. She had seen enough on the road to know when something didn't fit. And that moment didn't fit. Meanwhile, far from the highway, the situation she left behind was no longer static. Inside the hospital, things had begun to change in a different direction. Not loudly. Not immediately. But steadily. The man she had rescued was no longer just recovering in silence. Awareness had taken root, and with it came clarity. The fragments of the accident were no longer just fragments. They were becoming memory. Reconstructed, piece by piece, into something more complete. The crash. The loss of control. The impact. And then, the moment after, the presence that shouldn't have been there. The hands that pulled him out. The decision that interrupted what should have been an ending. That part kept returning, not as confusion, but as focus. Because survival alone doesn't leave questions. But survival with intervention does. And questions always lead somewhere. Back on the road, Emily continued driving, unaware that her life was still split between two realities. One she could see clearly, the highway, the deadlines, the house slipping away. And another she hadn't yet been fully pulled into. A chain of understanding was forming on the other side of the distance she had left behind. Information wasn't just being processed. It was being connected. Her name. Her situation. Her struggles. Pieces of a life that had been invisible to most people, were now becoming visible to someone who had the ability to do something about it. And once that kind of connection is made, it doesn't stay passive for long. It moves. It builds. It becomes something else entirely. Emily reached a familiar stretch of road, the same one she had driven countless times before, but even familiarity couldn't soften the tension building inside her now. Every mile felt heavier than the last, not because the road had changed, but because she had. And somewhere she couldn't see, something was already in motion. Not as a reaction, but as a decision. A choice being made away from her awareness, one that had nothing to do with chance anymore. And as the sun continued to shine over the highway, unchanged and indifferent, one truth quietly settled into place without announcing itself. What started on that perfect day was no longer an accident she happened to witness. It was becoming something that was now connected to her. Directly. And permanently. But she still didn't know it yet. And that made everything more dangerous than before. The days that followed felt almost identical on the surface. The road, the engine, the deliveries, the endless movement from one point to another, with no real pause long enough to process anything deeply. But something underneath had changed. Emily could feel it, even if she couldn't explain it. Not in a dramatic way. Not in anything she could point to directly. But in the way silence felt slightly different now. Heavier. More present. The accident should have stayed behind her. A moment on the road. A decision made under instinct. Something that ended when she returned to driving. But it didn't. Instead, it followed her in a quieter form. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but slowly builds pressure in the background until it becomes impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, far from the highway she traveled every day, the man she had pulled from the wreck was no longer in the same condition she had left behind. Recovery was progressing. Slowly at first, then with more clarity as time passed. But physical healing wasn't the only thing happening. His mind was working differently now. Reconstructing everything. Not just the accident itself, but everything surrounding it. The randomness that didn't feel random. The perfect weather that made the crash more visible, not less. The timing of the response. And most importantly, the person who changed the outcome. What began as fragmented memory had become structured understanding. A sequence. A pattern. And patterns always lead to questions that demand answers. At first, it was curiosity. Then it became focus. Then something else entirely. Because the more he understood what had happened, the more attention shifted away from the accident itself and toward the person who had chosen to intervene. Information started to surface. Not from him alone, but from systems that connect lives in ways most people never think about. Records. Details. A life that existed far away from where he was now, Emily Carter. A name that began to carry weight the more it was understood. A truck driver. A life defined by constant movement. A financial situation under pressure. A home tied to years of personal history now threatened by time and debt. Each piece revealed something deeper than the last. Not just who she was, but what she was losing while saving someone else. And that realization created something that didn't exist before. A direction. Because once you understand someone's struggle, it stops being just information. It becomes responsibility. Back on the road, Emily continued her routine, unaware that her life was no longer isolated from what had happened. She drove through familiar routes, completed deliveries, checked deadlines she was already behind on, and carried the same quiet pressure she had been living with for months. But now, it wasn't just one burden anymore. It was two realities moving toward each other without her knowing. One rooted in survival. The other already shifting beyond coincidence. Because the man she had saved was no longer just recovering. He was acting. Not impulsively. Not emotionally. But with clarity. And clarity always leads to decisions. Decisions that extend beyond hospital rooms. Beyond distance. beyond the boundaries of what most people expect from a single moment on a highway. Emily, however, remained unaware of all of it. Still focused on miles. Still focused on time. Still focused on a house she was slowly losing. But something was changing now in a way she couldn't see. Not yet. Because somewhere beyond her line of sight, the consequences of that sunny day were no longer settling. They were moving closer. And for the first time since the accident, the distance between her life and his life was beginning to disappear. The sun was the same as it had been on the day of the accident. Clear. Bright. Unchanging. But everything underneath it felt completely different now. Emily drove home that day with the same exhaustion she had been carrying for months, the kind that never fully leaves, only gets redistributed into smaller pieces so it can be tolerated. The road back felt familiar, but not comforting. Familiar in the way something feels when you've repeated it too many times while trying to ignore what it's becoming. Her thoughts were divided between survival and uncertainty. The mortgage deadline had passed in her mind more than once already. Every scenario she imagined ended the same way. Loss, paperwork, silence inside a house that used to feel alive. She had done everything she could. Everything she knew how to do. And still, it wasn't enough. When she finally turned onto her street, nothing looked unusual at first. The same houses, the same quiet atmosphere, the same stillness that never seemed to change, no matter what happened in her life. But something felt wrong in a way she couldn't immediately define. Not danger. Not fear. Something more subtle. Like the world was waiting for her to notice something already in place. She parked the truck slowly, turned off the engine, sat still for a moment longer than usual, then stepped out. The air outside felt different, even though it wasn't. The sunlight was the same, the environment unchanged. But perception had shifted. Everything felt slightly heavier, as if reality itself had slowed down just enough for her to catch up to something she hadn't seen coming. She walked toward the house. Each step measured. Each second stretching slightly longer than it should have. The mailbox was there. Simple. Unchanged. But something inside it didn't belong to routine. There was an envelope. Official. Clean. Final in a way she recognized immediately without needing to open it. Her hands hesitated for a moment before touching it, as if physical contact alone could confirm what she already feared. Then she opened it. And read. Once. Then again. And then everything inside her stopped resisting what the words meant. The mortgage was gone. Fully cleared. No remaining balance. No legal threat. No expiration. Just absence. For a few seconds, she didn't move. Not because she didn't understand, but because her mind couldn't immediately accept that something irreversible had just been reversed. Her eyes dropped slightly, the paper trembling in her hands, as reality slowly shifted into something unfamiliar. And then, she noticed it. A vehicle approaching. Slow. Controlled. Deliberate. It stopped in front of her house. She didn't need to see who it was immediately. Something inside her already knew before recognition arrived. The man from the accident stepped out. No longer unconscious. No longer trapped between life and uncertainty. Fully present. Fully aware. He looked at her house first. Then at her. And for a moment, neither of them moved. Because everything that had happened between that sunny highway and this moment had been invisible in real time, but fully connected in consequence. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything that didn't need to be repeated. The accident. The decision. The survival. The research. The understanding. And finally, the action that followed. Emily looked down at the document again, as if confirming it one more time would make it feel less unreal. But it didn't change. It was still done. Still complete. Still irreversible in the opposite direction of what she had expected. And only then did the weight of it fully settle. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This was intention. A response to something she had done without expecting anything in return. The man she had saved wasn't just standing in front of her now. He was the reason she was still standing there at all. And as the realization fully formed, one truth became undeniable. That moment on the sunny highway was never just an accident. It was the beginning of a chain that had finally completed its way back to her. And for the first time since that day, Emily understood. Some decisions don't end when they're made. They return. In ways you never expect. And sometimes, they return to save you back.